Okay, so we've hit 9 o'clock. So what I will do is just make a start on sharing the working principles for this session. So firstly, Chatham House rule, which I'm sure you will all be aware of. We are recording the session and it will be available, but we will not be attributing information explicitly to any attendees. I also need to draw your attention to the competition law statement, which all of our meetings adhere to, and I will read this statement out, and if at any point you are concerned that we may be breaching any of these points, please do let me know. So the statement that we need to adhere to is we agree to conduct this summit in a competition compliant manner, which will not involve any discussions, decisions or subsequent behavioural change that may be construed as anti-competitive, nor shall we act in a manner that could be construed as advertising or promoting our own business or business concerns or soliciting for business or work. Competition law concerns can arise in a number of ways, including from the exchange of commercially sensitive information, from an agreement or a more general understanding, or decisions to boycott or to refuse to deal with certain businesses, agreements amongst competitors to impose unfair trading terms, as well as agreements which fix prices or which otherwise limit output and supply. Failure to adhere to these conditions will result in the premature termination of the webinar. So please do let me know if you've got any concerns at any point, and we will press pause or move on. Right, so still while we wait for any others to join, an outline of the session this morning. So really the main aim of this slot now is to go through the Scope 3 measurement and reporting protocols for UK food and drink consultation document that we issued. So if you don't have a copy of that document, I believe that my colleague Sophie has put it in the chat, but also if you're having problems accessing it, then do drop her a line in the chat with your email address and she can email you a copy. I'll give a little bit of background to why we developed this document, but I won't be going back to basics. So an upfront apology that this session assumes some prior knowledge, and yeah, I hope that you have it to hand, and essentially what we will do is talk through the structure of the document, why, like the sentiment behind some of the content. I will also summarise the consultation feedback that we've had to date, which has been enormously helpful. So thanks so much to those of you that have provided input. I've got some questions for you towards the end, and one of those questions is whether you need a bit more time to input on the document as well. So if you do, there will be that opportunity. Please throughout do drop any questions or comments that you have in the chat or in the Q&A function. Sophie Harrison and my colleague as well, Stephen Mackenzie, who are RAPS GHG specialists, will be on hand to answer those questions and comments. And I'll also pause from time to time just to see what kinds of questions are coming in. And then lastly, I'll just cover off next steps and where we're going from here. Okay, I'm just going to turn my camera off because I move a lot around when I speak, and I will go through first some background context. So really, we started these discussions a couple of years ago when we were talking to a number of food and drink businesses who had established their own GHG targets or were working on setting targets, which included their supply chain or Scope 3 emissions. And they were all essentially saying they have the same challenge around how to robustly track progress and how to understand actually if actions are translating into emissions reductions. And a lot of businesses were working in isolation, and that was leading to a huge proliferation of different measurement approaches. Also, we were hearing difficulty from businesses in the supply chain facing multiple requests for information. And a lot of this was, I guess, creating firstly an uneven playing field, but also more importantly, creating inertia and somewhat of a barrier to progress. And we heard about many initiatives, but no real forum that brought together different parts of the supply chain to help us collectively move forward faster. So that's why we started the work in this area in Courtauld. At the same time, and increasingly over this period, we've been aware that there are many and increasing calls for disclosing supply chain data and for greater transparency. But really all of these need much greater consistency of accounting and measurement, much better access to information and data along the supply chain, or at least data that's more fit for purpose. And really, we need to, in all of this, ensure that the burden is not just pushed up the supply chain. So there was a real need identified, and so we set up the Courtauld GHG Working Group. Importantly, this has included voices and stakeholders from across the entire value chain. So from retail, hospitality and food service, through suppliers, through farming bodies and a wide number of industry bodies and NGOs, and also government departments. And I guess more of a working community than a working group, but the breadth of representation particularly is key. And this collective over the last couple of years and for this financial year agreed and set us some priority actions and tasks for the last year, one of which has been to develop a more consistent set of Scope 3 measurement and reporting principles for food and drink. Other tasks have been more focused around access to data and more consistent ways of asking questions in the supply chain. And we have a session this afternoon at 1 o'clock that is specifically talking to those points. This session this morning is with regard and focusing specifically on this measurement and reporting protocols piece. And the background here and the reason why we were steered towards developing a more consistent set of Scope 3 measurement and reporting protocols for food and drink is really the background that there are a number of global standards in place with some aspects in development, but in a number of places, these are really open to interpretation, and also they don't always really well address some of the nuances and some of the very unique challenges for food and drink businesses. So in general, we had quite a loud call for more consistency and to together agree an approach, a set of rules that UK food and drink businesses in the first instance could collectively agree as the approach, and we'd be seeking to get these government endorsed. We're also seeking then to be talking to WBCSD and others about more global alignment on measurement and reporting for food and drink. So what we issued on the 17th of January and also is in the chat that you can access or get from Sophie is a consultation document that has a proposed structure and content for what this consistent measurement protocols might include. So, and what this does is really summarize a lot of the existing global guidance. So drawing from the GHG protocol Scope 3 standard, from SBTI, from the gold standard, value chain document, the WBCSD Scope 3 Scope 3 transparency pathfinder from some of the EU documentation and from WRI's food loss and waste standard and others, brings it all together in one place and builds on those global requirements and proposes some specific interpretations and requirements for food and drink businesses. What it also was seeking to do is pull together, I guess, or propose a pragmatic approach, acknowledging the current limitations on available data, which is a really important point for food and drink. As I noted, the intention is that these protocols are formally adopted by the industry and by government departments to establish a more consistent basis for measuring and reporting Scope 3, especially where publicly reporting, which I think is a really key point. We are also talking to the GHG protocol team to get this kind of properly rubber stamped as built on GHG protocol, so an official supporting document as part of the suite of GHG protocol materials. We are proposing that it's updated periodically because this is an evolving space, and we suggested a 2-year period, and I'll explain the feedback that we got on that. And we've had a large number of consultation responses and a very detailed set of consultation responses, which has been extremely helpful. So that's come from businesses, particularly retailer, hospitality and food service, manufacturers, but also a number of consultancies that are undertaking Scope 3 accounting on behalf of businesses. So that's got a wider, I guess, information capture, and then also from a number of industry bodies as well. So just firstly wanted to say massive thank you to those that have provided input so far. And like I say, we'll keep that consultation period open. It's really helpful to get that first insight to be able to report back today as well. So in terms of some of the general feedback on the overarching aims that we proposed for the document, actually pretty much, in fact, everyone agreed with the document's aim. And there have been some helpful suggestions on how we could or should provide clarity on how it will operate alongside SBTI. So we'll be also talking to the SBTI team on that point. A few helpful points on kind of flagging who would likely be using it, and suggested that would be mainly sustainability managers or technical consultants working on their behalf. And we definitely acknowledge that this was also aimed at larger businesses, and that we need to consider over time how to make this easier for smaller businesses and more summary documentation, and I'll come back to that. Most people agreed with the 2-yearly review and update period, but I think a really helpful comment that we will take on board is that we need to build in an allowance if a major change happens to, for example, changes in the global standards and guidance, like we know with the land sector and removals guidance and the SBTI flag guidance that's coming online, that we have a review point if anything major changes before that 2-year period. We also had some comments, I think quite helpfully, that the food and drink emission factor data sheet that we issued alongside the Word document should be or could be updated more regularly, perhaps on an annual basis. And I think that's a sensible suggestion, and we'll come back to that this afternoon as well. I asked a question about the name, and mostly people agreed with that, maybe including some wording on kind of clarifying that this might be sector guidance. So generally feedback was that they're in agreement with the kind of intended aims. In terms of how we've structured the document, we've essentially mirrored the steps of the GHG protocol Scope 3 standard, and the requirements in there, so the requirements of the protocol Scope 3 standard and SBTI are repeated in the document in the relevant places. but we've also then added recommendations or requirements that provide additional specificity or to enable greater consistency or to be helpful for food and drink businesses. We've also in places added requirements from other standards and guidance so that everything is in one place. I won't talk through this slide in any kind of detail, but I just wanted to flag essentially that the chapters mirror the steps in the GHG protocol. There's a big chapter 6 is the largest, and that's on purchase, category 1 purchase goods. Talks a lot about data and data requirements and data sources. There are some supporting annexes with some suggested content, and we've had some useful feedback on that. Things like, so we cover other scope 3 categories, data requirements and sources in the annexes. We've also got some things like checklists for what to look out for when reviewing embodied emissions data, and recommended format for supplier questions related to GHG emissions and reduction actions. And those were very well received. Section 5, and I can see that there's stuff coming in chat and Q&A, so I'll pause I'll pause after this section just to see if there's anything pertinent that we need to pick up. But section 5 is quite an important one, which outlines which scope 3 activities businesses should be including within their inventory. And the GHG protocol requires that companies shall account for all scope 3 emissions, but it does have a clause specifying that some can be disclosed with justification of any exclusions. What we wanted to do in this section is a few things. One, set a minimum bar for what has to be included, and we based that bar on SBTi requirements for targets. We also suggested basing that bar on what we know to be the most material scope 3 categories for food and drink. And we also, to save a bit of time on materiality assessment and also to encourage focus of effort in the right places, we included a table of which categories are likely to cover that threshold and are likely to be significant for different kinds of food and drink businesses. And we also suggested that downstream emissions could be optional or separately reported because of the uncertainties around knowing what happens to products once they've left your boundary. Just clicking on to I won't talk through these, but this is just an image of the table in the document where we had suggested different categories for different types of manufacturer, processor, retailer, and different hospitality and food service. In terms of feedback, actually, this is the place where we've had most feedback. That most was in agreement with the sentiment of this section and the proposed requirements, but, and quite a big but, particularly for some sectors, and hospitality and food service came out quite strongly here. There were some strong feelings that downstream emissions should not be optional, especially where they've been marked in that table as material, which actually on reflection, I would definitely tend to agree with. And particularly called out have been things like downstream transport, use, waste, waste at end of life, which actually is a little challenging. And there were some useful suggestions to firstly maybe include more guidance on downstream emissions and signpost data sources. And secondly, potentially to consider or map out a pathway for companies to follow to help them improve and later fully report on downstream emissions so that they're not always optional. So we have a little more thinking to do there. There was also lots of queries on the shading in the table 5, which we need to look at, and some really useful points to take on board, particularly kind of determining, like making it clearer how they were determined. And there's also a bit of discussion that we want to have with the GHG protocol and science-based target teams on the suggested thresholds and ensuring alignment with their sentiments around sector-specific rules on this. We also had good feedback on the need for a case study on materiality assessment and how helpful that would be, and some, I think, some offers of providing case study content there. So in terms of that being a section, I think, where we had most disagreement, what I think we will do is come back with some proposed amendments to this section before we finalise the document. I don't think they will be a significant divergence from what we propose, but just more of a fine tuning. And at this point, Sophie or Stephen, I just wanted to double check, is there anything in the chat or the Q&A that I should be aware of?
We've had a few questions through about how we're going to cater for SMEs and how we're going to make them aware of this work.
Yeah, good question. And if we could park that and come back to it, because I've had some helpful suggestions on that front. So in which case, let's come back to that one, and I will move on for now and then just pause again in a few minutes.
Karen, we also had one question come in about, I'm going to read it out. With downstream emissions, does there need to be very clear organisational boundaries so as to avoid businesses double counting, especially processors and suppliers to food service and retailers? Would the point at which a product is ordered and collected by a chosen logistics provider mark that boundary? So basically, it's just building on that table that you were showing up before.
Really helpful, and we'll capture that in the feedback. Double counting, I think, will always be an issue, and I think is less of an issue in terms of a business's own inventory. I'll come back to double counting in terms of tracking progress, and the main challenge to be aware of in double counting is that we're not counting the same reductions twice. So that, I think, is probably where we could build in some more specific examples. Okay, so just moving on from boundaries, and definitely points to pick up there. The other thing on boundaries, or in section 5, that we included content on was around land use change and carbon removals. So both of these, we basically flagged that they're subject to significant uncertainty and inconsistency in accounting. There is global guidance coming online on this topic. The GHG protocol, land sector and removals guidance is currently out for consultation, or very soon. And there'll be it's been delayed a little, the pilot testing in that, we think, now from June. And then the SBTI flag guidance is out for consultation. So what we put in the document essentially is that we will defer directly to this when published, and that these emissions should be separately reported. And in terms of feedback that we got on these requirements, there's also a recommendation around where effort might be prioritised. In terms of feedback on that, most, in fact, all really agreed with the principle of deferring to the global guidance when it's published. So a number of points were raised, quite rightly, around the practical data challenge here, particularly, for example, where land use change isn't separated out in underlying data sets, which we'll come back to in the session this afternoon, possibly. And then also the lack of consistent data on carbon removal. So there's kind of big data gaps, but the principle around that they should be included and working towards including them, and for now separately reporting them, was mostly agreed on. However, there was a suggestion to make this a recommendation until the global guidance documents are finalised, which I would also tend to agree with. So that is likely to be our course of action. And then what we will do is use the publication of the GHG protocol, land sector guidance and the flag guidance as a trigger point to update this document. So that would probably be in a year's time, but would only affect this section. And when we do that, provide a bit more guidance on these sections and on data availability and such like. Also a suggestion to tighten up some of the wording, because I had been a little sloppy in having a requirement that also had a get out clause if where possible. So just tightening up some of the language when it does become a requirement. The next section that is the really meaty one that I wanted to move on to before pausing again is the boundaries and data requirements for category 1 purchase goods and services. So this was covered in section 6, and it's the largest section, and it covers any and all requirements on category 1. The GHG protocol has a minimum boundary that essentially all upstream cradle to gate emissions for category 1 purchase goods must be included. What we've done in this section is proposed some specific requirements for food and drink businesses relating to data coverage and quality. So we have suggested a screening step, and then we have suggested some requirements for the threshold for good quality activity data, and that should be weight or volume based data on purchases as opposed to spend based. And we've proposed a threshold based on quality for a kind of a threshold quality for embodied emissions data. And that should cover a certain proportion of emissions based on screening. So really what this is trying to do is to drive greater efforts on those areas of emissions that have been identified as most important during screening. So a way of focusing effort. We've also very heavily focused on data quality and suggested that there should be a summary of data sources and findings from data quality assessment reported alongside the inventory. This slide just includes, I guess, some context. So section 6 on embodied emissions data for purchased goods. So I think it's 6.4. It's quite a big section because it's a really challenging area that I know we all struggle with, but it's really critically important. So we've included quite a lot of content on important areas to consider. We've also included some narrative that other emerging standards talk a lot around favouring the use of primary data, but for food and drink businesses, really the current state of play regarding the capacity of suppliers to provide this data and the inconsistency of methods and things like farm accounting tools means that at the moment it's not really realistic or not always meaningful to specifically require the use of primary data in the shorter term. So we felt it was more meaningful to encourage assessment of data quality and to default to the best quality data sources, be that primary data or be that industry values or other values where they're available. What we did include is a hierarchy, a proposed hierarchy as a guideline on preferred data sources, I suppose. But what there is a narrative also in there that this might not always hold true and that selection of data sources should be based on data quality assessment. Also that it should be based on focusing effort on the biggest hotspots, and we should be aiming for continuous improvement. I'm not going to go through this table and these data sources in detail because we'll cover this in a lot more detail this afternoon. I just wanted to flag the important things around the sentiment that we're pushing here. I'll pause again in a minute, but just to summarise that the consultation feedback received on this so far, which was that I guess mostly people agreed, well, firstly, because we focused this section on food and drink purchases as opposed to other purchases, so non-food and drink purchase goods. Most people agreed that we should focus there because that's what's most significant, but we should include some clearer clarifications on packaging and a few other points that we'll definitely pick up. Some suggestions throughout this section that case study content would be helpful, and some offers for case study content, so with thanks. For activity data, apologies, the window cleaner's just come if you hear some background noise. For activity data, there was mostly good support for signalling a shift away from spend-based activity data. But there was some warning that this would be very hard for some, and we shouldn't be penalising people for making a start and using spend-based activity data to make a start. So there are a couple of suggestions that we should consider, and we will consider. One, potentially allowing spend-based data, but requiring that initial inventory should include a plan of how they will obtain better quality data, so that there is a forward trajectory, and another that maybe the threshold should be lowered, consistent with the embodied emission factor threshold. So some things to consider there, and interested in your views. For embodied emissions data, again, most were supportive of the focus on assessment of data quality and the hierarchy we proposed. Some were saying we should be continuing to push for better data, and we can strengthen that point. And again, the minimum data quality threshold may be too demanding for some. Some suggested that we should start with a lower bar. So we will, and maybe ratchet over time. So we will also consider that point. Sophie or Stephen, just because like we've covered like really the bulk of some of the thorny aspects so far. So again, I wanted to pause for if there's any key questions or points coming out.
Yep, we have one question through asking if we're planning to develop a template calculation sheet in addition to case studies.
We've suggested including a template screening sheet, which I think actually would be particularly for purchase goods, which we could use alongside the emission factor data sheet that we've issued. Other than that, probably something to think about, may be quite challenging because everyone's scope 3 is very different. But yes, definitely on screening. Otherwise, something for us to think about.
And then we've got another question about where people should be looking for the data. So stating that some of the PEFs are based on relatively old data, is there a time period at which they're considered useless?
What we've done is put in a data quality assessment framework that has a scoring approach based on a number of criteria, including time. The reality is that we've only got a certain amount of data to play with currently, but the session this afternoon is all about actually how do we move beyond that. So yeah, we're kind of a little bit stuck with what we've got, but definitely reviewing data quality, particularly for material hotspots, and aiming for continuous improvement is the sentiment.
And then one last question that's just come through. Will redistribution organisations be required to measure and report data?
I'm going to pass on that one for the moment. This is aimed more at food and drink businesses that are placing product on the market. I had not considered that. So yeah, to come back with, you can drop us a line with your email address and we'll come back to you separately on that one.
And then another one just popped up. Will the template of screening include upstream transport emissions, especially for imported goods?
So in the data sheet, actually, where transport has been separately included in embodied emission factors, we have separated out those life cycle stages. It's not always disaggregated. For transport, actually, if you transport distances, we've included in the document essentially a signposting to the base GHG factors for company reporting, which has different transportation factors. But something for us to think about. So a good point, thank you. And we will definitely cover the data side in a lot more detail this afternoon if you're able to join, and we'll record it. But
that's from the chat for the moment.
Move us on. So section 7 of the document included essentially everything and anything around setting a target, tracking emissions and reductions over time. And really here I've actually got a little less to say, because the document really just summarised existing requirements from the GHG protocol scope 3 standard, but also the SBTI documentation, and we need to add in stuff from the flag guidance, which actually got issued the day after we issued this document. So we've got some backtracking to do. It also picked out content from gold standard value chain interventions guidance and some bits of the WWF basket metric and the WRI food loss and waste protocol. And it covered things like choosing a scope 3 base year recalculations, setting a target, accounting for like the inventory method and project methods for reduction accounting, double counting, and then there was a section on quantifying reductions in scope 3 emissions, specifically from reducing food waste, because that's a common question. We didn't add in any specific requirements or recommendations for food and drink as yet, but we included some questions, and some of the feedback on that so far has been that on the baseline question, most people suggested it would be helpful to include some recommendations or guidance on baseline year setting, and that should align to SBTI. We should make a point around suggesting a baseline year that aligns the threshold of good quality, potentially. There was a suggestion around a 3-year average, which quite a few people felt would be impractical, would slow things down, and I would tend to agree. I think a useful point that we should be explicitly noting that COVID years will not be representative. And there were some offers of case study material on baseline, especially with COVID challenges, which I think would be very helpful. Rebaselining, most suggested just continue to defer to SBTI requirements and strengthen the summary of these. Target setting, yeah, defer to SBTI and add the content on the new flag requirements. Project method for accounting for interventions, we included a kind of a chunky section on that, mixed views on that content, and some suggestions that a worked example might help, and that the content and that example made specific to food and drink, which I would tend to agree with as well. And then on double counting, requirements here being the role for SBTI, but most feedback suggested that some guidance or a worked example would be helpful, as this is quite a challenging area and this section in general needs to be made clearer. So we will take on board those points with thanks. Reporting. Now, section 8 of the document covers reporting, and what we included essentially was some proposed requirements for food and drink businesses when publicly reporting Scope 3 emissions inventory. And that was some detail in a table, which I've included a screenshot of, but obviously you can't read the content there. Just for reference, that was in conformance with the GHG protocol, as well as the requirements and the recommendations that were throughout the document. I also put in a query about producing a common reporting template, and I suggested that this document wasn't the place to require public reporting or any kind of specifications around frequency of reporting. In terms of feedback on these points so far, I think firmly most were saying don't require the use of a common template. Many companies have established their own processes for reporting into SBTI or CDP, particularly multinational companies, and that they should be able to defer to those. But we could include as a best practice example or recommendation. And with regard to the table of the content that we had included, I think there was a suggestion that that should be more best practice recommendations as opposed to requirements. People felt that it was helpful additional content, but that reporting requirements are more the place for SBTI. So we'll also discuss these points with SBTI and the GHG protocol teams, but that seemed to be the overwhelming strength of feeling, and also that this document shouldn't be requiring public reporting, but could encourage or recommend public reporting. So with that in mind, we also need to work through, and some pointed out that we hadn't worked through or added something about how this document would be used in practice. So like whether there's some kind of statement of adherence or conformance in existing reporting templates or such like. So we need to think that through a little bit, but I think the steer has been quite clear on that. Also on assurance, we didn't actually include much on assurance in the document. We just signposted to the chapter in the GHG protocol where assurance is covered. And the feedback was that assurance again should be as a recommendation only. But I think people felt that having some examples and maybe summarising the key points from chapter 10 in the GHG protocol Scope 3 standard would be helpful. So we'll take that point on board as well. Onto the annexes, and I'm nearly finished going through it all. The annexes were actually kind of more straightforward. We were proposing suggested content, and the question was always, would this content be helpful? Most people fed back that pretty much all of the content in the annexes would be useful. There were more mixed views on Annex D, which is the annex which was suggesting having a table of emissions reductions activities and levers. And I think it probably reflected the divergence of opinion based on where businesses are at on their journey, or the different types of businesses that were responding to that question. I think it would be more helpful for some, less helpful for others. So we will include it, given that probably the majority said it would be helpful. So we will progress as proposed with the annexes, and then some more general feedback on the intent here, I suppose. As a couple of summary questions, we asked whether we had the right balance in the document, where we were trying to be as directive as possible, but leaving flexibility, recognising that actually everyone's Scope 3 is different, so there isn't a one size fits all. And we're also mindful that data availability is limited, so accounting will be imperfect, but it mustn't stop efforts to measure and manage emissions. So what we've tried to do is propose a pragmatic approach that helps with consistency in the short term, but allows for continuous improvement over time. And people seem to feel that we did have the right balance on those 2 points. We asked a question about what would help, particularly for smaller businesses. So the suggestions that we've had so far were around summary versions of the document, some helpful things like data shopping lists to get people ready to start, maybe something around outline of expectations in terms of data improvement over time. So for different data categories, what's the minimum requirement, mid-range expectation, and what would be best practice? So trying to paint a picture of progress expected or desirable on data improvement, and maybe some sector-specific templates. Public sector catering in particular got called out as an area that needed to be strengthened. Only other overarching point on the document was that it's a bit long, which it is quite long, but also most have suggested that the content included is needed. So it's a tricky one to balance those 2 points, and I guess is where maybe some summary documentation could help. I have now got to a point where we have a poll to issue to ask you some questions, and Chloe, I think, is going to launch that poll. And I thought, whilst you were looking at those questions, I'll explain the sentiment for some of those questions. So in developing this draft, we focused on summarising and building on key requirements from the other global standards and guidance to try and establish a more consistent basis for measuring and reporting Scope 3 emissions. I guess we're looking for a temperature check from the audience now on how important you think it is that we work towards greater consistency, specifically for food and drink businesses. So kind of how important is this document really, and anything that comes alongside it. Then does this content that I talked through or that you've seen meet the need? Completely, mostly, partially? And then the third question is how important is it that we align to global standards, partly because some of the feedback that we received actually was not disagreeing with the content that we put in, but it was disagreeing with the content of the global standards, but we have to defer to that. So I'm just checking, I guess, again, that that is the need here, that we should be deferring to global standards. Next 2 questions are about if you would like more time to provide more detailed comments. We've got a load in the chat, it looks like, that we'll definitely capture. Our next step will be piloting this document in practice alongside some of the other supporting stuff like the emission factor data sheet, and alongside like supplier questionnaires, maybe the screening template. If you'd like to, we'll be doing that with Courtauld businesses, and if you'd like to participate in that, let us know. And then we've got a multi-choice question, select as many as you want in terms of what kinds of things would be helpful for us to prioritise efforts on developing further content. So whilst we leave you to respond to those questions, Sophie or Stephen, are there any more questions in the Q&A or the chat that I should be attending to?
One quick practical one is that question 6 not allowing multiple choice at the moment. So if we could have a quick look at that, that'd be great. And then, I'll read this one out directly. If public reporting is not required by the new guidelines, is there a danger this will be seen as a lack of transparency by the food and drink industry?
Interested in others' views maybe in the chat on that one. I think the main point here is that firstly, most were saying that is a point that, and I guess a role of Science-Based Targets initiative as an organisation setting requirements around reporting. public reporting, I guess we are hearing noises, and maybe down the line there may be a shift towards mandating public reporting of scope 3 emissions. I think the feeling generally is that because we are where we are on lack of consistent data sources and lack of access to information, particularly on purchased goods, which is the most important category, it's really hard to see how businesses can be required to publicly report when that information is not available to them. And it's a very hard task to do. So maybe it feels a little early to require public reporting. Doesn't close the door to it. It's just that the stage we're at now is that I guess there would be question marks about how meaningful some of that reporting could be.
And another question we've had through, in addition to what is included, will there be very explicit highlighting of what isn't included? And just noting that sequestration and its allocation will be important to highlight.
Yes, I guess we could do, yeah, let's think on that one. So at the moment, yeah, we are talking about deferring to global guidance on including carbon removals, which would include sequestration and storage. But yeah, we've talked about actually the consistency of approaches and like the guidelines on that at the moment, hence why suggesting, I guess, a recommendation for now and also separate reporting on that. But yeah, point to consider, thank you.
And that is it for the chat for the moment.
Excellent. Did we sort out the poll issue? And
just going to relaunch it as another poll shortly.
And I've just had another question through as well. So clients are expecting transparency. There's an expectation that carbon emissions are understood. Are we informing the government to the gaps to feed into further iterations of the carbon reduction plan?
We do have a number of discussions with government, so with teams in DEFRA and at BEIS coming up, and we have particularly talking to DEFRA quite a lot about this, particularly the National Food Strategy White Paper team, and particularly around the point of access to supply chain data and data for purchased goods, and what that future landscape looks like towards better data. And actually there are some really, I guess how they're thinking about it is looking very promising and very useful. And we think there could be some really significant developments coming online in that space. So I think that's a watch this space, but yes, in continuing dialogue with particularly DEFRA on some of the data issues and in general where biggest emissions hotspots are, if that's the right sentiment for the question. Should we launch the responses to the first poll? Can you do that, Chloe, whilst there's voting on question 6?
You can't do that simultaneously, I'm afraid.
What's that, sorry?
You can't do that simultaneously, I'm afraid.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes, and then any final questions in the Q&A, Sophie?
We've had a question about how we're aligned with the WRI Cool Pledge.
So I would say aligned in that both will be deferring to GHG protocol. In terms of data sources for the Cool Food Pledge, actually we are including the data sources that they have used in our emission factor data sheet. So I would like to think completely aligned there. Probably we're taking things a step further. So maybe if we can launch the poll now, and then I'll come on to next steps. Okay, brilliant. So hopefully you should see that on your screen and be able to scroll down. So on the first question, very important. On the second question, mostly, which is fair. On the third question, very, or moderately, but yeah, that gives useful steer. Some want a little bit more time, quite a few interested in piloting, and yeah, a range of responses on what would be additionally helpful. So that's really helpful steer. Thank you for that. My last slide now is just on our next steps. So following this consultation stage, which we will leave open for a little longer, and we'll send out a communication after this on that final cut-off period, and also probably we'll come back particularly on that section 5 where we saw actually quite a lot of feedback. So we intend to publish a full version 1 late April on RAP's website. Alongside that will be the food and drink emission factor data sheet, and also we've done some work on common supplier data questionnaires for some key product types. So we'll publish that all together, and then the intention is to test that in practice through some pilots. So please let either Sophie know, her contact details there, or your RAP contact know if you would like to be interested in that, would like to participate in that piloting. We'll send around some more information on it. I talked about the supporting resources session on data this afternoon, to which you are extremely welcome. We'll be using the Courtauld GHG Working Group essentially ongoing over the coming year and beyond to really steer the development of any further resources in this space. And the next meeting we have planned is on the 6th of April, and we're going to use that just to propose and get sign off of the work programme for the coming financial year. So that is the final slide from me, and amazingly we are pretty much bang on time, I think. So just wanted to say thank you for joining this session. Thank you for your input so far. I can see there's a lot of stuff in chat, so thank you for that. Thank you for your feedback. It's really important that we get your views and input on all of this. And I will sign off for now, and I will look forward to reading all of this content in the chat, because I have not looked at any of it. Because I'm looking at the slides. So thanks so much for now, and I will sign us off.